panel. So the moderator for the high-level panel to discuss the overarching theme, digital inclusion and access for a resilient West Africa, which is what we really need right now, leads the multi-stakeholder engagement across Africa for the Alliance for Affordable Internet. She focuses on advancing good practices in policy and regulatory frameworks for affordable and most of all, meaningful access to broadband. She also convenes the Africa Summit on Women and Girls in Technology, which is also vital. We're talking about digital divide, digital equity, gender equity. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I introduce you to Onika Makwakma. Onika, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your surname. It's equally as tough as mine. Onika, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks to the West Africa IGF for this invitation and this opportunity to be with you today. It is actually my second ever IGF. My first one was last week, the Ghana IGF. And so there's just something about West Africa that's calling me right now. So thank you. I truly appreciate this opportunity. As many of the speakers have spoken before this session, we have heard that this period of COVID-19 pandemic has been characterized by a very strong digital flow carried out by individuals, economic entities, political and social entities that has placed the resilience of information systems to the test. Hence, the theme of our discussion today on digital inclusion and access for a resilient West Africa. It has also energized activism of internet governance actors with a strong focus on access to the internet as an essential lifeline. However, many more individuals, as we've heard, are still not able to connect or fully reap the benefits of this digital revolution. I will be joined by an esteemed panel of colleagues who have many years, who've been working on these issues and probably stay up at night a lot, thinking through these issues around digital inclusion, especially, and where we are today. How do we actually make sure we build on this, silver lining of the experience we are going through to make sure that we have the kind of systems resilience and, cohesion to bring everyone along and make sure that the internet is truly for all in our regions. I am going to invite, I believe, Raphaël, Dr. Raphaël KOFFI has already spoken. Is he still going to make a presentation at this moment? Or
yes, Anika. So unfortunately, the commissioner that was supposed to deliver the opening remarks was unavailable, so Raphaël stepped in. Okay. But Raphaël is still on the high panel.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to invite each of the panelists to first make a presentation for about 10 minutes. And then thereafter, we will have questions and answers. Please, there is a Q&A tab on your screen. Kindly begin to utilize it so that we are able to begin to see your engagement along the way. May I please invite Dr. Raphaël KOFFI at this moment?
Merci. Je suis encore désolé parce que j'ai du mal à...
Thank you. I apologize because I'm having problems following with the videos. For this panel, I'll try to say a few words, and if necessary, during our exchanges, I can go in depth about certain aspects. First of all, I'd like to thank Madam Moderator for her words, and we'd like to talk about inclusion and access. But when we talk about digital inclusion, I think it's pretty simple. It means that all citizens will have access to telecommunication services, whatever that may be, whatever the specificities may be, or whatever their gender may be, or even their age, or even maybe they could be handicapped. But unfortunately, in our region, we've witnessed quite a few challenges when it comes to inclusion at that level. The first challenge I'd like to mention is the cost of services, which are not often affordable for the population. If you look at the statistics, or the world statistics at least, you notice that in certain populations that are in ECOWAS, you notice that quite a lot of them are living with less than $1 per day. So we really do have to be sensitive to their means and how they're going to have access to telecommunications. So once the pandemic started, which infiltrated into the ECOWAS region, we had to continue with our activities, but we moved online. All our interactions moved from being physical to online, and that was trade, health, everything was moved online. Internet is a high cost, which means that one part of the population will have to be marginalized. And so we will not be able to attain inclusion, the digital inclusion that we hope to have. So it's very important for our regulators to quickly have a look at the cost of internet access, as well as the cost of broadband, because more and more, if you notice, some of our services tend to eat up a lot of broadband. Now, the other issue is the cost of equipment, that is smartphones, computers tend to be very expensive. So it will be important for us to sit down together and discuss this aspect so as to bring down the cost of equipment. And one of the discussions we should have is maybe to reduce the taxes on the import of equipment and technology that's to do with telecommunications. Some countries have already started in this direction, and I think it would be good to generalize this effort in our region. Another challenge that could prevent digital inclusion is the knowledge and the skills of our population. So even if we reduce the cost of equipment with our policies, well, the issue will be we don't know whether or not the populations will be able to have the means to use what they need to access internet. So if we take into account the need to adapt what we have so that it will be so that our citizens will be able to have internet easily. So maybe it's important to maybe disseminate information in local languages, find tricks and ways to identify. So in the case of, we could say, illiterate citizens of our society, maybe we could find creative ways to ensure that communication goes across to them. So for those who cannot read or so on, we can talk about pressing colored buttons. Now, in the last years, we've tried to find ways of solving issues. When it comes to access, in 2016, we adopted regulations when it came to access to national and international access to terrestrial networks. And the objective of these regulations was to allow countries to have access to submarine cables in the same conditions of coastal countries. So studies have shown that the cost of terrestrial broadband, which is approximately 70% of costs. So we need these regulations to facilitate access by having access to the submarine networks cables. In 2017, we reviewed the Traditional Act on Services and Universal access. This was adopted in 2007, and would like to use this opportunity to thank F4AI, who supported us with the revision of this act on that helped us to have a more inclusive economy. The objective, as I said before, was to allow different services so that all our citizens, without discrimination, will have affordable tariffs. In 2019, regarding the inclusion aspect, we adopted a policy for persons that have impairments or handicaps, and we wanted to guarantee the access of such persons to internet, as well as TASIP applications so that they can participate fully in our society. Ladies and gentlemen and participants, Madam the moderator, ECOWAS today has launched a program, digital program for the youth in order to increase employment, to develop access to employment for the youth. Because as you all know, thousands of young men and women die as they're trying to cross the sea or the oceans towards a better future. And why? Because they do not have the means. So today, information technology could provide a solution to end the dangerous immigration of our young citizens. So ECOWAS is working in this direction, that is to develop capacity, build capacity, help them build and create jobs for themselves, and of course, limit and put an end to illegal immigration. So, Madam Moderator, I'd like to stop here, and I can answer any questions that will be addressed to me. Thank you very much. I'm giving over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for those inputs. You've raised some really pertinent questions for us, challenging us that, yes, while we might meet affordability, there's still an issue of digital skills capacity. So beginning to also look at the demand side issues to connecting everyone. We will definitely, please do keep the questions coming, and we'll definitely come back to this topic, I'm pretty sure. If I may please now invite Dr. Isaias Barreto da Rosa, who is the Executive Chairman of the Board at Multisectoral Regulator Agency of the Economy, also known as ARME. Dr. Isaias, are you with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. Allow me to start by expressing my gratitude to the West African IGF for the kind invitation so that I could be here today and participate in this very important event. Madam Moderator, I just have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share for a couple of minutes. So I don't know if I have the permission to share my screen. I shall try that. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Madam the Moderator, allow me to take 3 minutes of my time to talk a little bit about Africa before jumping into the main topic, which is digital inclusion and access for a resilient West Africa. Now, Madam Chair, we in Africa, we have, Madam Chair, Madam Moderator, yes, that's correct. We have in Africa a continent of 30 million kilometers square. If we look at this map, this is a very interesting map because if we look at ourselves as a continent, we have enough space to put the entire European continent inside Africa. Europe has something like 10 million kilometers square. We still have space, room to pick the United States of America, including Alaska, which has around 9.5 million kilometers square and put inside our continent. And there's still room for more. There's still room to pick China with 9.3 million kilometers square and put inside the African continent. And we still have room for more. We're talking here about a continent of 1.3 billion people and a continent that has 1/3 of the world's natural resources. We're talking about a continent with a lot of potentials. Very often when we talk about the African continent, we only emphasize the challenges that we have, the difficulties that we have. But we also have many potentials that are worth sometimes emphasizing. Again, Africa has 1.3 billion people, China has 1.4 billion people. It's interesting to note, however, that our GDP per capita is greater than the GDP per capita of China. It's interesting to note that we have less poor people than China and more computers than China. This is just a comparison, of course. We have the second mobile phone market in the world, according to the African Development Bank, with more than 80% of our population owning a mobile phone. According to the GSMA, in sub-Saharan Africa, the mobile phone industry contributes with something like $120 billion to the economy, which is something like 8.2%. At the world level, the contribution is 4.5%. So the contribution of our mobile industry to the continent's GDP is almost as the double of what happens in the other parts of the world. So we have a continent with lots of potential and where ICT is also playing a key role for the development. It's my humble understanding that especially here in West Africa, ICT is the engine for our development and our regional integration process. In the meantime, we have challenges. If we look at the internet penetration rate, for instance, in Africa, this clearly shows that we as Africa were lagging behind. While according to this compilation made by the Internet World Stats, at the global level, we're above 60%. In Africa, we're still around 43% in terms of internet penetration rate. And of course, in ECOWAS, we are a little bit better than the African average, around 54, 55% internet penetration rate, but we are lagging behind. We have in the continent two major issues when it comes to internet access. Three major issues, I would say. We need affordable internet access. We need internet access. We're talking here about infrastructure. And of course, we need good policies and regulatory framework to promote access and affordability. If you look at West Africa, for instance, the internet penetration rate between our countries, they vary very much. They go from 11.9% in Togo to 73% in Nigeria. So what should we be doing in the sub-region in order to make sure that we have connectivity, we connect the unconnected, and we also have affordable internet access for all our citizens? From a humble perspective, in order for us to win this battle, we need at least two things. We need to work definitely on infrastructure. We need to bring connectivity to the remote areas where we don't have connectivity, but we also need to take important decisions when it comes to regulation and policy. We can have the best infrastructure in the world, but if we don't have the right regulation in place, if we don't have the right policies in place, this infrastructure will not make us achieve the objectives that we want, which is affordable internet for all. So which initiatives do we need to implement in order to make sure that we have, we bridge the digital divide, we connect the unconnected, and especially that we have affordable and meaningful connection for everyone? We definitely do need to improve connectivity in rural areas. In West Africa, 80% of our population live in rural areas. In the meantime, in these very same rural areas, we only have 25% of our telecoms infrastructure. Something is not right. If 80% of our population live in rural areas, why on earth should we have only 25% of our telecoms infrastructure in rural areas? Something must be done, and we definitely do need to invest in infrastructure for rural areas. In Africa at large, according to the ITU, 4G coverage in urban areas is 3 times bigger than in rural areas. Again, in our continent, most of our population do live in rural areas. We need definitely to focus on the development of infrastructure in rural areas. And of course, we talk very often about fiber connectivity. Fiber is important and it is key to bring connectivity to rural areas. But we should not neglect the reality of our continent. In Europe has, for instance, about 10 million kilometers square. In Africa, we have 30 million kilometers square. And we have 80%, in West Africa, we have 80% of our population living in rural areas. And these areas are very often very remote. In order to bring connectivity to these places, satellite connectivity is key. We should not neglect satellite connectivity to bring, to connect unconnected, especially to bring connectivity to these remote places. But we should also focus on universal service as well. Many countries, not only in the region, but in Africa, they already have a universal service fund. And very often we have the money sitting in the bank while there's a strong need of developing infrastructure. We need to use this fund. And we need to make sure that this money is used to develop the infrastructure that we so much need in our continent and in our sub-region. We need to do it in a non-discriminatory and in a transparent manner so that this fund can really be used to connect the unconnected and especially to make internet access more affordable. But also, apart from these infrastructure-related initiatives, there are some policies and regulatory initiatives that we definitely do need to implement. We need to promote competition in the market, to have a level playing field for all the players in the market. Very often we see in the continent that in some cases, governments might eventually say, okay, this is our company, our operator, so we have to move ahead with initiatives to protect our company. In the meantime, that's exactly the wrong vision. We do need to have a level playing field for everyone to promote competition, innovation, and at the end of the day, if we do that, the market will win. We will have competition in the market, we'll connect the unconnected, and we'll have affordable prices on the market. It is key to promote competition in the market. And of course, that is a good way to promote innovation and investments, because if we have a level playing field for everyone, of course, we will attract new players, more investment into our market. However, if we have very protective, policies and regulatory measures in place, then we will have problems. But we do need to also have an enabling environment for the entrance of new players, especially in rural areas. In rural areas, we need to be innovative on the way we work to bring connectivity to these places. We could, for instance, promote community-based network. Network set up, implemented, and managed by the community. And of course, we need to have measures and policies in place to promote this community-based network. We need to streamline the rights of way. In many of our countries, we see that operators face a lot of problems when it comes to the right of way, because they have to get permission from the regulator, from the central government, and from the many local governments. And that, of course, creates a lot of problems. We need to streamline the rights of way. We need to promote innovation. Another important aspect related to policy that we should definitely not neglect in order to bring connectivity to those who need, and especially to make sure that we have affordable and meaningful connectivity, is related to spectrum. Technological neutrality when it comes to spectrum. We need to facilitate and not make things life more difficult, especially for the players in the market. More flexible spectrum usage rules is of paramount importance to, once again, create this enabling environment. Dr. Raphaël KOFFI mentioned here tax incentives. We should definitely consider reducing taxes, for instance, on terminals. We've seen some African countries doing that, some even West African countries doing that, and the results are very, very, very good. When we do that, of course, we'll have more people acquiring these equipments. We are promoting connectivity, but of course, and the government should look at that as an investment, because when they reduce terminals, they will collect more taxes from, because we'll have more people connected, using more services, and they will get more taxes. Another important aspect that Onik at some point mentioned here is related to the demand side initiatives. We need to put in place initiatives to reduce digital illiteracy in our sub-region, so that people can indeed know how to use ICT facilities. And we need to work on the development of content in local languages. Of course, we have our official language, the colonial languages, and we're still using one at the moment. But it is important for us to take into account that the majority of our population does not speak, these colonial languages, and we do need to develop content in local language. And finally, the establishment of internet exchange is key to make internet access in our countries more affordable, more secure, and of course, even faster in terms of quality of service. So in conclusion, Madam Moderator, I would say that in Africa, in West Africa, we need to work on infrastructure to make sure that we connect the unconnected, but we should also work very hard on moving ahead with good regulation and good ICT development policy, so that at the end of the day, we can have affordable and meaningful connectivity for all, so that we can bring connectivity to those who are not connected and bridge the digital divide. Madam Moderator, these are my initial considerations. Thank you very much indeed.
Wow, thank you very much for that really comprehensive submission. You've given us a lot of nuggets to know as we pick up this conversation. I am now pleased to invite Dr. Dawit Bekele, who is the Regional Vice President of the Internet Society in Africa. Dawit, are you available?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Onika, and the whole West Africa IGF team. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings to friends in the panel as well as in the participation. I wished it was a face-to-face meeting so that we can all see each other, but unfortunately we have to wait for some time, maybe next year, hopefully. I will try to share my screen. Okay, 49% of the world and 60% of Africa is not connected. Well, the numbers might vary depending on what statistics we use, but this is, I think, the statistics that have been provided by ITU and on which we can rely. This means that we have a long way before universal access. The lack of affordable access to the internet and the disparity in levels of access across the world remains a key challenge. It creates competitive and economic disadvantage, as we have seen during this pandemic. Those who have internet access were much less affected than those who didn't have access, since they could study, work, and shop online. They could also meet with their loved ones, which makes the isolation less difficult. I think more than ever before, it is clear that the internet gives huge socioeconomic benefits to those who have access to it, and disadvantage to those who don't have access. Having said that, Africa has, and the whole world has made major strides in improving internet access. You can see here in the statistics given by the ITU in the Digital Trends in Africa publication. There has been some progress, even lately from 2017 to 2020. The individuals having access to the internet has increased from 25.5% to 33.1%, mainly due to mobile internet access. The fixed access at home has not really increased much, but the mobile has increased. This is good news, but it is not good enough. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there is still a lot of disparity. And by disparity, I mean disparity in the region, in West Africa or in Africa as a whole. As you can see here, there are countries that are doing well. I'm sure my friend Isaias is happy to see that Cabo Verde is performing well in West Africa, with about 62% according to ITU statistics, and I think Internet Stats have higher statistics. And there are unfortunately some countries like Liberia where you have, I think, about 8% of the people connected to the internet. And we also have, of course, disparity within the country, such as, for example, regional disparities. Some parts of the countries are better connected than the other. We also have rural and urban disparities, where urban areas are better connected than the rural areas. Sometimes we have also disparity between genders, and as it has been indicated earlier, also disparity between those who have disabilities and those who do not have disabilities. And these are not good news, because we have seen during the pandemic that it really increases the gaps, not only for access, but this access disparity has impact in the socio-economic development of communities. So it is something that we should all be concerned. So let me change the slide. So what can we do and should we do in the coming years to have an inclusive West African digital society? I think we have to work more to bridge the access disparities, but something that we have realized in the last few years is that access alone is not enough. We need to have an internet that is resilient, that we can rely on. For example, someone who has a reliable internet can participate in this panel, but someone who doesn't have a reliable internet might not be able to do so, because he or she will fear to be interrupted anytime. And this goes equally to in education or other things. You cannot really use online learning if you don't have a reliable internet with good quality bandwidth and so on. Therefore, it is important to have to bridge those disparities as well as improve the resilience of the internet. So how do we do that? Of course, we have to work on the regulatory and policy environment. My friends KOFFI and Isaias have spoken a lot about those regulatory and policy interventions that are needed. So I'm not going to say more. There are also other things that which are also related to regulatory and policy issues that are a little bit more technical, which is to interconnect Africa. Unfortunately, due to our history, maybe, we are prone to connect to the rest of the world and less to connect ourselves. As a result, for example, the first connections were done to Europe, France, or England, and as a result, Africa was not interconnected. The good news is that more and more countries are connecting with physical cables to their neighboring countries, which is very good. But we also see increasing numbers of logical interconnection with ISPs connecting to each other at internet exchange points. For example, the study that we did and we published recently called Moving Towards an Interconnected Africa showed that between 2010 and 2020, the number of internet exchange points increased from 19 to 46. And the traffic exchange also has increased considerably, which shows that Africans can now really exchange information without passing through other continents, which is a good news, and it has been possible thanks to many of you here. I would like to mention especially the African Union, ECOWAS, and other partners who have worked with us during the last decade to make this happen. The other thing that we need to deal with is to connect those who are really lagging behind. And as I think most of you know, in Africa, we have the majority of the population living in rural areas. And unfortunately, those areas are sparsely populated and not interesting for commercial operators. And this has a major impact on the interest for commercial operators to come and serve those communities. And we have seen over and over that the commercial model does not always work to connect those people. As a result, we propose that we use complementary solutions. It doesn't mean that we are opposing commercial operators. On the contrary, we need commercial operators where it is viable, but where it is not viable, we need to think of other solutions. And as Raphaël, as Isaias said just before me, one of the solutions is to use community-based solutions, or what we call community networks. And these community networks are viable in these areas because they are not their main interest is not profit, but to serve the communities. They are done by the people, for the people, and as a result, their costs are generally lower, and they can be sustainable if they get some support from governments, the regulators, and so on. Sorry, for some reason I have difficulty to, okay. Last but not least, we have to make the internet more resilient. What we call internet resilience is the ability of a network to maintain an acceptable level of service at all times. Even though we hear a lot about challenges of internet resilience in Africa, and unfortunately, we often witness it because, for example, in these kind of Zoom calls, many have to interrupt their calls often. We don't have enough data. It has not been measured sufficiently. For this reason, with our partner Afrinic, we have developed a project called Measuring Internet Resilience in Africa, or MIRA, that tries to identify what are the levels of resiliency in various African countries, and to analyze what makes an internet infrastructure more resilient than others, and propose recommendations for policymakers and regulators of actions that they can take to bring a better resilience for the networks in their countries. In this regards, I would like to invite anyone who is interested to work in this project to approach us, because we need to involve as many countries as possible. And right now, especially in the West African countries, we don't have enough countries that participate. And I will be very happy to work with you so that your country is included in the project. And in general, for the world, and not only for Africa, we have a platform which is called Internet Society Pulse platform that you can access using the URL indicated here, pulse.internetsociety.org, which gives a number of measurements on the internet, starting from internet shutdowns and other traffic information, etc. I'm sure that there is something that might be of interest, so I invite you to view it. But in relation to resiliency in Africa, and especially in West Africa, it is important that we identify what are the issues before taking the measures that we need to take in order to have a resilient internet in West Africa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dawit. I'm sure we'll have plenty follow-up questions on your presentation as well. Just a reminder to please use the Q&A chat box to post your questions so that we can be able to bring your voices into the discussions later on. I am now going to invite Dr. Alison Gilward, who is the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, to make her presentation.
Thank you very much, Annika. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And Annika, I know we're running over, and you know how I can always go on these issues. So please do just feel free to stop me when I've done my 10 minutes and to ask me to wrap up. I can stop at any point on this. And just to say how very strange it is to be at an IGF meeting, an African IGF meeting, but any IGF meeting without Fema Khan. That picture was wonderful, and could really feel his presence here. Yeah, so I thought with this, I would really I'd sort of be looking at people in all of this. You know, what does all of this mean for people? And really to focus on the impacts of COVID on digital inequality and the impacts of digital inequality on the outcomes of COVID in the African context. I think, you know, COVID and the lockdowns in particular that are associated with them have brought into stark relief the implications of digital inequality. Only a really small elite have been able to digitally substitute for work, for schooling, for banking, for food security, you know, for social grants, business relief. And really, you know, even food has been a major kind of disability for people who are not online, accessing food, life opportunities, the survival actually of people during this period. And so what we see is that, you know, we've always known that digital inequality reflects or mirrors and sometimes amplifies structural inequalities in society. But what we've seen with COVID is that digital inequality has had this compounding effect on structural inequality that people experience. So because they've been unable to digitally substitute, mostly people who are impoverished are the ones who are more negatively affected by this. So I think that, you know, just in this regard, it's quite important when we look at these aggregated statistics, and although we're lagging, we seem to be growing in that, these aggregated statistics really mask inequalities that we have in our society, you know, intersectional inequalities, whether it's around, you know, rural or urban, whether it's around gender, and particularly, you know, between the formal and informal sector. And so what we've seen in our kind of rapid response research that we can do with, you know, quite limited data at the moment, is that the pandemic has really ruptured informal value chains and prevented the informal sector from acting as the usual buffer that it does to these kinds of global, you know, economic shocks. And this is not surprising because we know from our After Access survey, which is of course, you know, out of date, but we can understand where the trend is going. It won't be significantly more than that. And even if it's doubled, it's still very low. Is that only 7% of informal sector businesses on average across the 10 African countries that we looked at in the informal survey were able to mitigate the negative effects of the lockdown through digital substitution, i.e. that they had internet access. Because we do see, you know, as Isaias was saying, you know, we do have these very high mobile phone penetration rates, but that 80% mobile phone penetration rate is not the internet rate, which is substantially lower, and more in line with the kind of figures that Dawit has presented from the ITU, and who we work very closely with on trying to get this data. Still, in many countries, is quite dependent on supply side data, which, you know, count SIMs rather than individual subscribers. And, you know, we've had lots of discussions and in various forums like these with the GSMA, with the ITU, and with other people using that data, World Bank, etc., on trying to get better data. We really just don't have good data. But what we do know from the 2018 data is that, and we've known for a long time, is that basically broadband penetration tracks GNI or GDP per capita. And so when we did the study across the global south, we could see that in, you know, South Africa, in countries in where there's similar GDP, actually performs very well in terms of mobile phone penetration, but actually in internet performs much lower, for example. And what you could also see is that, you know, certain countries, you know, like Nigeria, Kenya fitted more in line with some of the Asian countries, you know, lower income Asian countries, and didn't, you know, didn't perform that well when we just look at them on their own. What we also see, of course, is that there is a considerable gender gap, and the countries with the lowest internet penetration rates, we saw there, you know, from the African side, you know, Rwanda, particularly very high gender gap, which is surprising because of their very strong policies that they have around both internet access and gender, but very in line with these very populous, countries where we do see these big gender gaps with cultural differences. But the important point I want to make about this is that the gender gap is significant, and there are various factors that explain that, primarily access to education and the corollary of income and employment. But in fact, the rural gap remains, as people have been saying, considerably greater. And then, of course, if one looks at intersectional inequalities, if you look at women within the rural areas, etc., of course, we get even a better picture of lack of access around these different kinds of inequality. And just to say that basically the internet penetration rate aligns with smartphone penetration. So that measuring the part smartphones is really a critical part of regulating affordability and regulating access. And if we look at that study, we see that the biggest problem to accessing barrier to getting online is actually the affordability of the device. And so those important points that were made around taxation are absolutely critical. And once people are online, then the biggest challenges are around pricing. But obviously one has to look at that compared to just getting people online and then they can't afford to use the services. And I just thought what I would share with you now is that despite that rather kind of bleak picture, we've managed to do telephone interviews because of COVID for Nigeria and South Africa. And it's a part of a project that is really looking at the impacts of digitization on formality and informality, and on visibility to the state in terms of taxation, and also around social protection. So that's the kind of focus of it. But I think it really highlights the importance of digital access, and the intersection now it's at the core of all our economy. And I think the really interesting point that I just wanted to highlight from this, because I'm not going to have time to go into it much, but was the resilience around people with the limited access they had. So, in our discussions with some of the informal sector, we found that people just didn't have the smartphones or didn't have the data to be able to use them, etc. And what the study really showed was that people were using their phones to do remote work. People were using their phones for schooling. I think this, it really just goes to how important this is, and how people have used really inadequate devices in order to continue, to get their livelihoods, in order to remain educated. And we really, I think, as a country, as a continent, we really duty bound to address that. And then just also some interesting insights on, who were able to access social protection, and also who were able to do that online, and just some interesting differences around, whether women and men were able to do so, and some of that being dependent on their, income, education, and which correlate with access to digital services. So at many points, early on, for example, in the South African lockdown and relief in the grant system here, which is, very substantial and a very effective grant system. Initially, a lot of the requirements, but for business relief in particular, were required online. You could not, do them any other ways, which really marginalized small businesses and highlight that issue of the importance of digital substitution. And then just to show that, because of our lack of, digital connectivity and our digital equality, that it limits what can be done online in terms of retail, in terms of e-commerce, in terms of things that you might need, credit cards for platforms and those kinds of things. But then also just very interesting from our own point of view is that we've got these much higher levels of entrepreneurialism, self-employed, and that in Nigeria, which is interesting in terms of how it plays out in terms of taxation and visibility too. So you can look at those in your closer, in your own time. We can make these slides available, of course. And I think this point that I really wanted to say there, though, is that while we focus on connectivity, and connectivity is a precondition for digital inclusion, connectivity in this new data environment that we have on its own really does not redress inequality. The challenge is that as more people are connected digitally, inequality increases rather than decreases. And this is important because this is not just in the classical digital divide sense where, obviously there's a gap between those who are connected and those who aren't connected. But it's also the case between those who have the technical and financial resources to use the internet optimally, actively consume, reduce their transaction costs, and even produce online and contribute to the prosperity of nations. And those who are barely online, eking out a small bit of data in order to do some very, very basic communication. And of course, what this data environment raises is also the issue of data justice. And increasingly, this is a real tension between internet governance and the traditional champions of a free and open internet, and some of the inequalities that are perpetuated by current dominance of global platforms and of various products and services that run across the internet. And the increasing need for countries in order to redress these inequalities, both within countries but also between countries, to regulate, or at least some forms of economic regulation of the internet, to try and ensure digital inclusion and trying to ensure competitive fairness within their own markets. And I just flagged, because it's on tomorrow, that there's an African Union Digital Data Policy Framework consultation that's underway. This is a really important for the digital economy, for the single market for Africa. And as I said, has really significant implications, both for human rights and fundamental first generation rights, but also for social and economic rights of the continent's people. And so I just thought I'd quickly just highlight what can be done and what has been done under conditions of COVID. What have been the quick regulatory responses to the lack of connectedness? And one of them has been the granting of temporary spectrum. And although I'm often very critical of the regulatory environment in South Africa, I have to commend South Africa on getting temporary spectrum out very quickly. However, I want to just raise the point that although this improved connectivity for those who were connected, it did nothing for those who are unconnected, as did the Competition Commission's mandatory price reductions, who happened to coincide with the start of COVID, as did the basic grant that's being proposed, basic free data amount for people that's being proposed by the Competition Commission. So if we look at these, temporary spectrum was immediately allocated, as it had to be. I mean, you had to have people who already had networks and that to roll out, but it was granted to the incumbents, and it was granted in such a way that new high demand spectrum was used, which allowed the dominant operators to immediately go and test their 5G. That's where the spectrum was used, and obviously there was increases in 4G. And basically, what happened is that people got more data for their subscriptions. So they got more data for the amount that they were paying, but there weren't any measures to actually bring people online. There were 2 TV white space licenses granted, and of course these have longer term potential if the temporary licenses are shifted into longer term licenses. But of course they're not operating yet. And then importantly, during this period, and because of the real sort of identification of the data-driven pandemic for the first time, the importance of a just data governance framework within disaster management regulations that obviously need to place health issues and collective rights above certain privacy rights, although they're not mutually exclusive. So just very quickly, I'm not even sure what I've lost my minutes, but very, very quickly, let me just quickly say, what policy interventions then could be, could we immediately implement, and what are the kind of longer term issues that we have to deal with? And in the short term, I think we've got a dual strategy in terms of rapid, effective implementation of what is known to work and that we haven't done. So in many of our jurisdictions, we actually just haven't done certain things like, release the spectrum, sufficiently in time. We've gone into auctions that we haven't been able to manage very well and push up prices. We haven't, attached universal service obligations to those, and not necessarily in the traditional sense, because I think, there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of failure there, but, linking that to, infrastructure sharing, linking that to access to dominant networks, offsetting auction prices with, if people are infrastructure sharing, or if they're allowing virtual operators or microcell operators or whatever to operate on their networks. So, that's stuff that we haven't done very well. And then we also, we can't carry on doing the same thing and hoping for different outcomes. So we really need to look at, every point of policy and regulatory intervention and be focused on ways in which more enterprises, formal and informal, households and individuals can actively be brought online. This has to be our priority if we are going to do something differently, and if we're going to not go back to the old normal, that in the reconstruction, the reset that people are talking about, we actually do something differently. Because at the moment it looks like everybody's quite quickly gearing back to going to old models that we have. And so very quickly, I can see Annika's there, and I think it's probably because my time's run up. So let me just quickly say, that we have to do something differently. And the current business models that we've got, the exclusive licensing frameworks, the extractive rents by government, sometimes through the auctions and through license fees and those kinds of things. We have to rethink all of these things. We have to rethink universal service levies and how they're being operated. We have to really focus on the dominant mobile companies who are able to set prices and leverage their dominance in the market and review, do proper market reviews and affect that. And then we can't ignore the fact that we have to look at these dominant global platforms that are really apparently accountable to no one and unable to access data, and we're unable to exercise data governance, privacy protection. But importantly also, taxes. So I've got a last slide, which I won't go to because Annika's there, but we really need to look at, removing social networking taxes that are really inhibiting people from joining the internet and are actually taking people off the internet. They're counterproductive because they actually reduce the amount of internet used and there's less productivity, less taxation. We need to work and extend on those devices being, the taxes for low-end smartphones being removed at the very least. And then, of course, we need to engage far more actively in the BEPS, the global digital taxation reforms that are offering us taxation where it should be taxed. So actually tax the big tech companies, not the poor end users who can't afford to do it. So we really need to engage far more actively while we look inwardly and we try and grow our markets and create fairer competitive environments. We also need to get those taxes that we do from these global initiatives. Sorry for running over. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you very much for that. That's a lot to digest there. And let me just quickly invite Mr. Pierre Dandjinou, who is the VP of Stakeholder Engagement at ICANN. And that will be our last presentation, and we will quickly move into a discussion and question and answer period. Pierre, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready, and thank you very much. And good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes. Yes, we can.
Yes, please. Okay. So glad to join, this West African IGF, and then as I would like to also we say that we are quite supportive of this sort of, meetings, and really congratulate, our good friends, the organizers, Maria and Mari and the rest. In terms of the topic of our discussion today, I thought I should just, bring in one aspect that we don't really further discuss, which is the what we are terming here the internet infrastructure, and see how best Africa and I would say West Africa is coping, and eventually what's there to be we should be doing in terms of making all of this I would say sustainable and resilient. Well, the other thing I would say, and most of the panelists, alluded to that one earlier on, but I would like to say that the COVID actually brought up a few issues. So, for instance, we noticed that it revealed the importance of internet, but at the same time revealed the importance of our strong, dependency on IP networks and also on digital services. And to such a point that in some capitals in Africa, issues such as, what they're calling digital sovereignty, is being discussed as an issue. Digital sovereignty, because the debate is being heated actually, and came from Europe, and then more and more have been done to really see what each continent should be, which strategy each continent should be developing to really cope with digital growth and also digital divide for if you are going to talk about ICANN. So which strategy do you put in place, actually? And I would say that as far as the theme of today is concerned, it all boils down to a kind of strategy that probably on digital divide that we might be setting up here. Some of the things that we noticed, also is that how do you strengthen, the African, what I might call internet infrastructure, so that we could cope with the situation? There was a mention of the dependency on what we might call the big players, the international big players, and where is the place of the local African, private sector in that regard in all of this digital transformation. Now, in terms of infrastructure, of course, we did have very good presentation by my other colleagues that presented the issue in terms of where we are coping with in terms of internet penetration, in terms of broadband, access, and in terms of how many Africans are now on the internet. And then what we are seeing here is that, well, there's still more job to be done if you want to really include, everyone on it. But I also believe that we need to consider a few other things, and those are what we are calling the critical elements, that really make the internet, function. And those elements, you probably know about them, but I would like to cite, 3 of them. You consider the root server system, for instance, that's I mean, the internet works because we do have this root server system in place. But not only that one, we also have the DNS, which is the domain name system. When you are actually having your domain names, when you are requesting, your web, you will see that definitely you'll be using those domain names, and those domain names correspond to some of the identifiers, that are the IP addresses, and that make the whole thing resolve. And then you are on the internet, you are on Facebook, you are on whatever. So these are quite important, I would say, tools. And it's always important to see how we are faring as far as these are concerned. Take, for instance, the root server. You probably know that we do have a total of 13 root servers, globally. But the fact is that those 13, actually, most of them, at least 11 out of 13 are based in the US. For historical reasons, actually, as you all know, internet started in the US, and for sake of protection, whatever, most servers, were hosted, in areas such as universities, and military compound and the rest. And of course, we do have one in Europe and one the point here is, which is also the us as a system, we can make sure that we position the root server, everywhere actually, depending on whether countries are interested or not. And the good news is that Africa is not absent for this root server system instances. I do have a few figures, and which are quite interesting for Africa. North Africa is hosting 9 of these copies, or we call them copies of the root server. West Africa, 24 of them are within North Africa. East Africa, 28. Southern Africa, 50 of the copies are there, which means that, well, Africa is, has something like close to, I would say, 100 120 sort of, copies, replicates of the server, which is quite good, which is not yet sufficient. Because why do we need those servers? Why do we need the root servers, the instances in our countries? You need it because it helps you solve many issues. For instance, you are keeping local information local at some point. Your requests are being local, are being treated locally, so that you are gaining in time, you are gaining in access time, for instance, and it is quite important. Of course, the 13 root servers, because there are 13 of them, you can host copies of all of them. So countries, for instance, take a country like Rwanda, they are hosting, say, 4 to 5 different copies, of these root servers. Some countries are hosting just one of them, but you can still host the 13 of them. It makes your system, your access quite resilient, and I believe this is something that is important to really we should be talking of in Africa. Now, what about the DNS? The DNS is quite important because it is your kind of phone book on the internet at some point. So how are we doing this on this one? The DNS, of course, help the whole work of translating or coordinating your domain name system and your IP addresses. But those domain names comes in different categories. You do have the GTLDs that you certainly know, the general top-level domain names, your .com, .org, but also .africa. All of them are generic. And then you do have, your CCTLD, your country code top-level domain, which is your country codes, which you are using. Now, how are we doing today in Africa? Well, we do have something close to 1,700,000 of total, domain names being used in Africa, which is way below compared to the, I would say, the international average. Suffice also to know that of this figure I've just cited, 1 million is, registration has happened in South Africa, and the rest of the continent, is sharing the 700,000. West Africa, totally, we might be talking about something like, which is below 200,000 of registration, which is quite, low and very low, because we still have countries where you have maybe 500 registration, out of a population of say 10 million, which is quite low. So many in the countries are using extensions such as the generic one, the .com and others that are fine, But the point is, you also do have your own domain name, so there is no point for you not using your domain name if you want to really keep, your data, local. So this is quite important, something to also understand. So in terms of DNS, it's important that we grow that services. But at the same time, DNS comes with a few things. It comes with security issue. So, and the COVID has proved that, the DNS is under attack. We at ICANN have to design sort of new way of, combating the threats. I'm not going to get into that one, but suffice to know that we are working globally, also locally, with the CERTs, with the computer emergency, teams, and to really see how best to cope with the threats that come with the DNS, because we also call it the DNS, abuse, for instance. And I don't have figures here, but I know that Africa is also under attack, for that matter. The point here is that not many countries or not many banking systems, of course, will tell you whether they have been attacked or not. But we do have systems where we can trace, this sort of attack. And ICANN is working on those. And I believe we do have 2 or 3 countries that are really collaborating on that one. And I believe in West Africa, for term of security of the DNS, we need to do more and to be in touch with those operators, of the resolvers of the DNS, so that we are able to really build some capacity here. The other thing in terms of DNS resiliency is how do you sign what we call your zone file, meaning we use a tool that we call DNSSEC. DNSSEC is important because it makes sure that your zone file on the root server is secure. Today in Africa, for for the 54 CCTLDs, we count something like between 10 and 15 countries that have signed their zone file, which means that the destination is still safe. So we can see that within our countries, there might be countries that destinations are much more safer than others. So we need to work on that one if you are talking about resiliency. And of course, when you sign your zone file, you also need to validate it regularly. So we need to have the capacities on the ground to be able to sign your zone file and validate it. It is not rocket science, actually, but it means that it's the level of consideration you give to that sort of new way of doing things, meaning the internet and the services, that you really put the appropriate, staff, to work on that one. So it is important. Now, the other thing is the IP addresses. ICANN has got, has provided, I would say, has set up, 5 what we call internet registries globally. And in Africa, we do have one which is called, African, and is based in Mauritius. So the thing, as far as the IP addresses pool is concerned, is that Africa is the only place now that we do have the IPv4, in terms of address. No other place has this one. So the last pool, globally, the last pool in the world is in Africa. And the question is about the policy we are going to put in place in Africa to really make sure that this thing does not become a kind of black market, that others will come and buy, these IP addresses from Africa. But the reason is that we have low consumption, of these IP addresses, by Africans themselves. So which means that in terms of internet, we need to really make sure that those tools are there, but also that we are able to actually work on the tools and to really use them, because we are not really use them the way we should be using. Of course, there are issues about the new sort of narrative that we need to have. What I'm talking about may seem technical, but that's where the internet, how internet works. And you have to be part of it. You have to be part of whatever policy you want to put in place to govern, this unique identifier, because there's a governance issue when it comes to these identifiers. At ICANN, we do have regular meetings to talk about, the policy development. We are seeing more and more Africans, and of course, I would like to encourage more of them to come and also be in the leading position in some of our supporting organizations and committees. So, to put it in a nutshell, internet infrastructure is about those unique identifiers that make the system work. It's about the DNS. It's about the root server. It's also about your IP addresses. Of course, there are other protocols. I'm not going to get into that one, but it's important that we pay attention to those 3 layers, of the internet infrastructure if you are really talking about resiliency. Of course, there are issues about, the private sector. How do you make sure that, your local private sector also rendering the services that are there? It's about whatever strategy or policy you put in place to give some sort of precedence eventually to those local entities. There are many other issues about geopolitics. Say, for instance, you are talking about digital sovereignty in Europe because you are fearing, this what we might call, trade battle between the US and China, for instance. So question could be, where is Africa? You are talking about GDPR, which is this data protection artifact that Europe, has actually provided. How are we using that one, for instance? So it's important that we come to data, data protection, because data is the key issue. There are issues about, your data houses, and how are we doing, in Africa in terms of putting them on clouds, but also having our artifacts, within different countries. So all of these are components of the internet infrastructure I wanted to address, and we need to take care of them. So that's what I would say. There's some homework to be doing in West Africa if you want internet to be resilient. I would like to stop here for the sake of time, and back to you, moderator, and thanks for your attention.
Yes, great. Thank you so much to all of our presenters today. I think we We've got a lot of information, really great understanding of what we are facing in the region, in as far as being able to get to a point where everyone can fully enjoy the digital benefits that are a requirement at the moment. So there's been a few questions in the text box. I'm going to just go ahead. I won't summarize any of the comments that have been made, but I have seen a note, your comments requesting presentations to be sent to you, and there is a response in the chat that you will have access to all of these through the website where it will be posted. So one of the questions that came on here is with regards to infrastructure, and that there's a lot of apprehension around 5G and environmental related issues. And so I believe, Alison, you had offered to answer this question for us, because we really sort of need to tackle and address some of these issues if we want to truly move to that next level where we are resilient digitally, and we also are not leaving anyone behind, but hopefully also not harming the environment as well. Alison, if I may ask you to unmute yourself and help us with this question, that would be great.
Thank you, Annika. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to speak about the environment in that context. I think my offer really related to speaking about the kind of the digital ecosystem and the impacts on that. Although I think this is such a critical issue, and I think if we look at what the UN Secretary General's comments around COVID and the twin challenges of climate change and digitization as the key factors that will influence how we deal with inequality going forward. That these are the two, I think he calls them kind of these seismic shifts that have occurred at the global level that will really determine, whether we use this disaster to rethink, reset, and produce new sort of social compacts that are far more equitable than they've been in the past. So although, I think a lot of the work that's been done around kind of green and green IT and that sort of thing, and green ICT and that has really focused on the ways, digital work or digital activity digitization can, reduce negative effects on the environment. So, by people working remotely and not using cars and these kinds of things, quite a lot of it's been done on the positive solutions that the technologies could provide. On the other hand, a lot of the new advanced technologies are extremely unclimate, green friendly, and so I think particularly the importance of looking at green energy in relation to digitalization and the absolutely astronomical amounts of energy that we're using as we create these massive global digital ecosystem is really a critical issue for us, and as I said, a really kind of important intersection on whether this increased digitalization is actually going to have a positive planetary effect than a negative one. So yeah, I think it is an absolutely critical issue. I think if you look at the big data warehouses, I know Terraco in Johannesburg, which I believe was maybe not any longer with some of these other new ones that have come up, but one of the biggest data warehouses on the continent. The cost of electricity was astronomically more than the cost of bandwidth at the time that bandwidth was a real constraint on the continent. So this is really part of the mix that we have to get right. It's not something which we can, if you look at blockchain, there was mention made of the potential that blockchain has, in terms of, providing security for, distributed systems security. But you know, the amount of power that it's using at the moment, the amount of energy that it's using at the moment is really, you know, we have to weigh those benefits enormously. So I'm sure there are people that are far more competent to comment on that, but I do think it's an absolutely critical issue for us, and we can't just look away. And just sorry, one last thing on that is that, you know, so much, there's been such success at the level of global governance of public goods in relation to climate, that, you know, there are real lessons for us to learn in terms of, you know, mobilization of the global south, to have their voice heard in these, you know, global governance forums that deal with these issues.
Great. So, you know, I'm looking at how much time we have, and I've scanned through the questions and comments that we have in the chat box. I'd like to ask each of you, if you were to recommend one game changer for a policy that we absolutely should work towards to sustain the digital flow that we are experiencing right now, post-COVID, but also in a way that brings more people and reduces the inequalities that we are experiencing, especially urban and rural, which is widening, quite frankly, as we focus more on digitization. So what would be the one policy or regulation that you think would be a game changer in us being able to gain greater traction on digital inclusion? Most of what I've heard here today, and I'm sure most people here, we are sort of in this bubble that has been discussing these issues for quite a long time. You know, what is it that now needs to happen in order for us to just have that one critical big change to bring, to create that surge that brings even more people along? And if I could have participants as well answer this question in the chat. Hopefully we can save the chat as well, but I would love to hear from each of the panelists. Isaias, perhaps we start with you.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. That is a tough question. Out of many things, just to pick one that you would consider the most relevant. Now, I would eventually pick one. I don't know if that is the most relevant or not, but for me, it applies to many of our countries in the sub-region. Policy initiative that would help bringing connectivity to the remote areas. I would say improve the Universal Service Fund. Why? Because again, we have many countries with the Universal Service Fund, with this money sitting in the banks, not being used. And this money can indeed be used exactly to bring connectivity to those places that operators do not want to go. They don't want to go there because it might not be a good business for them. And that's maybe where we can use this money to connect the unconnected and bring connectivity to these remote areas. So of course, I wouldn't say that this is the most important one, but from my perspective, it is a key initiative, policy initiative that can help bring connectivity to those who are not connected, especially in the rural areas. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So universal service funds, let's unleash them and use them the way they're supposed to be used, for one. So if I could hear from Raphaël. Raphaël, KOFFI, are you still with us?
Okay, thank you, Onika. I think one thing I want to emphasize on it. Okay, let me speak in English because everybody is in English. Okay, yes. Le takeaway que je voulais proposer, c'est...
What I'd like to suggest is the following. The effective implementation of policies and regulations.
Isaias a tout de suite parlé des fonds.
Isaias talked about the fond of universal services, and that is the lack of applications of the text that we adopted. So the adoption of text is a fact. It is part of the solution, but the effective implementation of such laws is that which will move our actions towards being effective. So if we do put implementation all the texts and the laws and the policies that we adopted, then we will end up reducing, or let us say, move towards digital inclusion. If I use that the example that has brought that from ECOWAS, that is to fight digital exclusion, we need to look at the text, the laws, we need to look at the handicapped persons. What do we need to implement? Has this universal service? Mr. Isaias has demonstrated that people do not implement that. So really and truly, the main element is that our member states should effectively implement the laws that have been adopted in order to move towards favorable access to to internet and access, technology access. And that is what I wanted to recommend. Thank you.
Great. Wow. Thank you. And that's really a challenge, quite frankly, because we tend to be a region that's great at developing really robust policies, but implementation just seems to have eluded us for quite some time. If I may now call upon who else is still here with us, perhaps Dawit. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nika. So if I have to choose one, I would say we need to empower communities, rural communities, to find their own solutions. In fact, rural communities are used to finding their own solutions. When there is no water, municipality water, they find their own solutions. In the telecom internet sector, they have been often banned from getting their own solutions because they cannot, have their own operators. This has to change. We need to give them the power to become their own operators. For that, regulatory solutions have to come, like, for example, allowing communities to have licenses, without much hassle, because they are not big operators and they cannot afford to pay high costs, etc. As Isaias said, the universal access funds should be given much more easily to those communities, so that even if they are not for profit, they can at least sustain. So if we empower the communities, they can find solutions to connect themselves to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Wow, great. And if I could just follow up on that a little bit, because you presented to us and you mentioned community networks. If there was a game changer for community networks in terms of spectrum regulation and management, what would that be?
Okay, that would be to give them access to spectrum, the most useful spectrum that the GSM spectrum, for example, that is not available for them, and very often that is underutilized, but that they cannot use because they would have to pay lots of money, and it is already reserved for other operators. So giving them access to quality spectrum much more easily.
Great, thank you. And Alison, same question.
Thank you, Annika. I'm going to be a little bit provocative because everybody said everything, but I think we have to think about universal service funds and universal access very, very carefully and very, very critically. There's very little evidence of success of these. Universal service funds worked from the kind of American cooperative model because you were trying to meet, the last 20% of the population, the last 30%, maybe most cases, universal service funds in the North last 15% of the population. But we are trying to meet the first, or the, first 30% or the first 20% in some cases. So, and, we've got to meet 80% of the population, not 20% or 30%. So we really need, something that's got far more, malleability and far more responsiveness to it. And I would say, if there's one thing, and it's very difficult, as everybody said, because these are all interconnected and require different things. But if there is one thing, it is actually, completely turn around the licensing regimes, the exclusive license regimes, and the dominance, of only the GSM, technology and model. So of course we want to keep those. These need to evolve. Our businesses, our competitiveness, and all of these things. These will evolve. They're going to evolve. We need to get the 5G spectrum out and all of that sort of thing. But don't just put a small, even a large universal tax on that, which just pushes up the prices. Actually, make sure that these companies are not able to get their very lucrative 5G spectrum until everybody's in the 4G, has got 4G spectrum and those kinds of things. That's different for different countries. And in many, many countries, we actually do have 90% broadband coverage, and yet we've got 30%, at best 30% in Lesotho, in Rwanda even less. In South Africa 90% coverage, or 99% coverage, 50% penetration. So they're definitely demand side issues, but addressing some of the supply side issues by enabling, have a default model so that people can, any small micro operator, anybody, there's a default that allows them to enter into the market with technologies that are more affordable. For example, it was said rural areas aren't attractive to commercial supply. Well, they're not attractive to certain kinds of commercial suppliers. They're not attractive if you've got a really expensive technology that requires expensive users to use it effectively. But, we've got big swaths of rural spectrum not used. We could put, dynamic spectrum technologies into there that would operate at a tenth of the cost, most of the costings look like, that GSM technologies would. So we really have to open it up, and it doesn't impinge on investment environments and those kinds of things. The big operators, the current people who have those licenses, aren't using that spectrum anyway. So we need to open it up. We need to make it available. We need to experiment to allow, as Dawit was saying, people to bring their own solutions, and not just communities. Communities are one sort of thing, but we've got micro licenses. Our 5G spectrum should be, your auction price goes down if you allow micro operators onto your network. Because there's also, the thing of actually getting the spectrum is great if you're going to be able to, operate a full network and things. But there are a whole lot of other solutions that could run on top of existing operators. And if that was, a way that they played universal service instead of paid, I think it would be far more effective.
Wow.
And it doesn't deal with digital inequality. We've got to address education, but that's the long-term goal.
Yeah. Great. And that really ties in very well to the earlier challenge you gave us about taxation, and that, we need to begin to demand big tech to pay their fair share of taxes. In fact, there's a great report that came out earlier this year that looks at the lost revenue for the continent from the taxation that we are not collecting from big tech companies, and perhaps it is time to collect and divert and give consumers a break a little bit and go get that from there. Now, Pierre, there is a comment in the chat that specifically for you in terms of is it time perhaps for the information about DNS education to become part of regular education of what we teach people, so folks don't need to just only come to these kinds of meetings to know about the information that you've just shared today. So perhaps for you, what would be that game changer in terms of getting more of us to pay attention and make sure that we've got truly a safe internet, and we are not just only consuming online, but we are also contributing towards building and developing the internet further?
Thank you very much. I think you actually responded to that question. the way you actually address it. No, you are right. I mean, it's all about education. There's a good point here that we should be able to be educating people on the internet and how it works. And you said it. If you don't do that, the way we use internet in Africa, we are just users. We are not doers of it. We are not really. I mean, the question is, where is the internet, business here in Africa? Because internet is also a business at some point. So, but before you get into that business, you need to be exposed. You need to be educated. So, yeah, I'm happy for that. If we could educate people right from the school about what it is behind the internet and what makes the internet works, that will help really understand. But quickly, in 1 or 2 words, please. The game changer for me, I think most have already been said by my colleague, and I totally agree with Alice. Alice has pointed to so many things, actually. But I think it's about, what is the African strategy on digital transformation? Because this encompasses so many things, So where is this? Maybe we are in need of, an African sort of strategy, given the condition out there. I spoke about Europe, for instance, with the internet sovereignty, for instance, digital sovereignty, and they came up with the GDPR. But how about Africa? What are we thinking? So the strategy should be there. So I believe, and finally, that there should be a change in the narrative, meaning we as techies should know how to talk to policymakers. Because the impression we are having is that we've been talking for so many years, but really not much is changing, actually. But because regulators or eventually policymakers or government may not be understanding what exactly the issues are. So if we could see a way in which we change the narrative and to deal with those issues in a kind of multi-stakeholder approach, not just techies are going to bring the impact. It's about the private sector. It's about the user. So how do we build that multi-stakeholder model within different countries and within Africa? That would be something that I think will change the game. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. We've unfortunately ran out of time. However, I just want to just flag that all of us basically brought us back to one slide, which I believe Isaias is the one who shared it, which basically said it's about the infrastructure and it's about policies and regulations. And, for us to be able to really, truly move this forward. And this conversation really reminded me of a campaign that we had in the region a few years ago called Fast Africa, FAST, F for fast internet, affordable internet, a safe internet, and a transparent internet. And basically all of our conversations just really circle back to that desire to move Africa fast forward with a fast, affordable, safe, and transparent internet. Thank you very much to everyone. Please, if you could kindly save the chat, I would be very much interested in helping you summarize some of the inputs that we got on the chat